In the frigid dawn of September 21st, 1327, Berkeley Castle, a formidable bastion of stone and shadow, became the silent, foreboding stage for one of the most chilling and macabre episodes in European monarchical history. Shrouded in dense mists that clung to its ancient battlements, and permeated by the funereal silence of its thick, unforgiving walls, the castle held its captive within. Edward II, a king stripped of his crown, his dignity, and nearly his sanity, was then 43 years old, languishing in its dark, damp corridors. He was a man utterly broken, weakened by the relentless bite of chains that chafed his skin, by the profound, soul-crushing solitude that enveloped him, and by a ceaseless torrent of daily humiliations designed to systematically dismantle his spirit. The oppressive darkness of that fateful night would not be pierced by the hopeful flicker of torches. Instead, it would be torn by muffled screams, guttural and desperate, yet so thoroughly suppressed that they never reached the ears of the outside world, vanishing into the cold, indifferent stone of the fortress. Later, whispered accounts, chilling in their detail, would emerge, claiming that an instrument of unimaginable cruelty had been employed. A red-hot iron, searing and incandescent, was introduced into his body through a horn tube. This was no mere act of violence. It was a calculated assassination attempt, meticulously designed to leave no visible marks upon the king's physical form. The extreme, unyielding heat would relentlessly burn his internal organs, incinerating them from within, while heavy, thick pillows, pressed with ruthless force against his face, served to ruthlessly muffle his dying cries, ensuring his final agony remained a private, unheard torment. The next morning, as the first pale light of day struggled to penetrate the castle's gloom, his body lay eerily motionless, a stark, lifeless testament to the night's horrors. The official cause of death, delivered with a chilling bureaucratic detachment, was declared as natural death. Yet, to any who dared to look beyond the superficial pronouncement, there was something profoundly, terrifyingly wrong with that silence. It was a silence that screamed of injustice, of treachery, and of a truth deliberately buried. To truly grasp the intricate web of deceit and desperation that lay behind this shockingly brutal, yet officially denied death, we must embark on a journey backward in time. Our path leads us to the very genesis of Edward's life, to his birth, to an early royal childhood that was anything but conventional, and to a reign that would become indelibly marked by a series of devastating scandals, profound betrayals, and a succession of ill-managed, catastrophic wars. Edward was born on April 25, 1284, within the imposing, strategically vital walls of Caernarfon Castle, a fortress designed to project power and command obedience. His father, Edward I, was a figure of towering authority, a warrior king who instilled fear across his realm and beyond, a man undeniably made for the relentless rigors of medieval warfare, and whose very being was dominated by an unyielding, absolute sense of his own regal authority. He was the hammer of the Scots, a conqueror, a formidable and traditional monarch. But from his earliest days, Edward II was conspicuously, almost defiantly different. Where his formidable father found solace and purpose in the clanging of steel and the roar of battle, the young prince found himself drawn not to weapons, but to water. He would spend countless hours immersed in the simple, yet for a prince, profoundly unconventional pleasures of swimming, rowing, and fishing. His interests veered sharply away from the martial expectations of his station. He possessed an unusual, almost scandalous admiration for craftsmanship, displaying a genuine fascination with the meticulous work of artisans. He often busied himself working with common tools, engaging in tasks as mundane yet as deeply unsuitable for a prince as roof repairs or the searing heat of the blacksmith's forge. These profoundly atypical inclinations, so far removed from the expected martial prowess and regal bearing of a future king, provoked a growing, palpable coldness between father and son. Edward I viewed his heir's diversions with a mixture of bewilderment and contempt, seeing them as effeminate and weak, a dangerous deviation from the stern, masculine path of kingship. When he was still a young man, a prince yet to fully grasp the heavy mantle of his future duties, Edward demonstrated a profound, almost obsessive affection for Piers Gaveston, a charismatic and handsome young Gascon knight. Their closeness was immediate, intense, and deeply unsettling to the established court. The king, Edward I, a shrewd and pragmatic ruler, quickly perceived the perilous proximity between the two. Seeing Gaveston's influence as a threat to both his son's proper development and the stability of the crown, he swiftly and decisively exiled Gaveston from the realm. Yet the young prince, desperate and heartbroken, pleaded passionately for his friend's return, going so far as to audaciously suggest that Gaveston receive a noble title, an unprecedented honor for a mere knight, and a clear signal of the depth of his favor. Edward I was, predictably, furious. For a man who had dedicated his entire life to painstakingly consolidating royal authority, to see his heir so intimately tied to a young courtier, a man of no significant lineage or power beyond the king's favor, seemed nothing less than a direct, egregious threat to the painstakingly established order, a personal insult, and a dangerous subversion of monarchical decorum. The ascension of a new king and his controversial favorite arrived with the death of Edward I in 1307. His son, Edward II, immediately ascended the throne, and with a breathtaking display of defiant loyalty, he wasted no time in bringing Piers Gaveston back to England. Gaveston returned not merely as a friend, but as a figure of startling prominence and unprecedented power. Edward II lavished honors upon him, most controversially naming him Earl of Cornwall, a title that had traditionally been reserved exclusively for members of the royal family itself, a clear signal of Gaveston's elevated and, to the nobility, utterly undeserved status. The ultimate affront, however, came during Edward II's own coronation. In a moment of supreme symbolic significance, the king allowed Gaveston to carry St. Edward's crown, the very embodiment of the English monarchy, a sacred relic during the coronation ceremony itself. The ancient aristocratic nobility of England was quite simply scandalized. Whispers, insidious and sharp, began to circulate through the court and across the land. Were they merely friends, as the king insisted, or was there something far more intimate, far more scandalous at play? Direct, irrefutable evidence of a romantic relationship between the two remains elusive in the historical records. Yet Edward's gestures, his blatant favoritism, and his utter disregard for aristocratic convention indicated something far beyond simple camaraderie. The king's infatuation with Gaveston alienated the powerful baronial class, leading to a relentless campaign against the favorite. Gaveston was exiled again and again, only to be recalled by the besotted king. This cycle of banishment and return fueled the nobles' fury until finally they could tolerate it no longer. In a brazen act of defiance against the crown, Gaveston was captured and brutally executed by a group of rebellious nobles led by the Earl of Warwick. Edward II was utterly devastated by the loss, his grief profound and public. Yet astonishingly, his pattern of behavior, his need for a singular, all-consuming attachment, would repeat itself. After Gaveston's fall, another favorite, even more grasping and deeply resented, would emerge, Hugh Despenser the Younger. His rise would usher in a new era of unchecked avarice, political upheaval, and ultimately a fatally betrayed queen and a kingdom humiliated beyond measure. Edward married Isabella of France in 1308, a strategic union forged to strengthen the tenuous ties between England and France. She was the daughter of the powerful and calculating Philip IV, a monarch known as Philip the Fair. This political alliance, however, began with a series of symbolic disasters that foreshadowed the marital and political catastrophe to come. During their own wedding celebrations, Edward conspicuously, almost cruelly, ignored Isabella, lavishing his attention instead on Gaveston, a public slight that deeply wounded the young French princess. After Gaveston's demise, the vacuum was quickly filled by the ambitious and ruthless Despensers, father and son. Hugh Despenser the Younger, in particular, swiftly became the new, all-consuming obsession of the king, and with it, the most hated man in England. The Despensers became the king's absolute confidants, mercilessly monopolizing all royal favors, amassing vast tracts of land through dubious means, and wielding undue influence over every significant decision of the crown. Their rapacious greed, coupled with their arrogant and often brutal exercise of power, created a legion of enemies across every strata of English society, from the lowest peasant to the highest baron. Then in 1314 came the unmitigated catastrophe of the Battle of Bannockburn. Eduardo personally led his army against the Scots, commanded by the brilliant tactician Robert the Bruce. The ensuing battle was a complete and utter rout for the English, a humiliating defeat that reverberated throughout Europe. Not only did it confirm Scotland's independence, but it utterly shattered Edward's already fragile prestige and left his authority in tatters. This defeat served as a potent catalyst, emboldening his critics and providing undeniable proof of his perceived incompetence. Queen Isabella, initially a quiet, dignified figure, whose quiet suffering had been endured largely in silence, became increasingly active behind the scenes. She was acutely aware that the Despensers were the root cause of the king's precipitous decline, and with growing certainty, she realized that their inevitable downfall could, and perhaps should, also be his. A queen, betrayed and humiliated, began to conspire. In 1325, Isabella was dispatched to France, ostensibly to negotiate crucial peace agreements with her brother Charles IV. This diplomatic mission, however, served as a mere pretext, a cunning ruse. Instead of fulfilling her royal duty and returning to England, she embarked on a perilous yet ultimately triumphant path of vengeance. She brazenly allied herself with the exiled Roger Mortimer, a powerful and charismatic nobleman who had narrowly escaped the Tower of London after a frustrated uprising against the deeply entrenched and tyrannical Despensers. Their alliance was a dangerous gamble, a direct challenge to Edward II's increasingly unstable rule. In September 1326, Isabella, now allied with Mortimer, boldly landed on English shores with a small yet determined army. To the astonishment of many, she was not met with resistance, but with widespread acclamation. Enthusiastically welcomed as a liberating force, a beacon of hope against the oppressive Despenser regime and the feckless king. Edward, gripped by panic, fled with his hated favorites, the Despensers, seeking refuge from the approaching storm. But their escape was short-lived. Both Edward and the Despensers were swiftly captured. Hugh Despenser the Younger, the king's despised favorite, met an end as brutal and public as his rise had been audacious. He was executed with exemplary savagery, publicly hanged, then drawn and finally quartered, a gruesome spectacle designed to serve as a stark warning to any who dared defy the new order. Humiliated beyond measure and stripped of all power and support, Edward himself was coerced into abdication in January 1327. This unprecedented act opened the path for the immediate coronation of his young son, Edward III, a new chapter for England, albeit one born from regicide and usurpation. The deposed king was then dispatched to the formidable confines of Berkeley Castle, not as a formal prisoner, for that would imply a legal process, but as a dire problem to be resolved with the utmost discretion and, above all, permanence. It was undeniably the grim beginning of the end for Edward II. At Berkeley Castle, Edward's final days were overseen by his new jailers, Thomas de Berkeley and John Maltravers, men whose loyalty now lay with the Queen and Mortimer. Initially, for a brief, deceptive period, he reportedly received treatment that was minimally dignified, a cruel charade of propriety. But as the days bled into weeks and the weeks into months, the conditions of his imprisonment systematically deteriorated, stripping him of all comfort and hope. The guards, mere instruments in a darker, more insidious plot, received orders that were deliberately ambiguous. They were not to directly kill the former king, for that would create a martyr, but they were to ensure, through constant deprivation and torment, that he would not, under any circumstances, survive for long. The methods employed were a chilling tapestry of physical neglect and psychological torture. Some historical accounts, whispered down through the centuries, speak of horrifying screams and unsettling noises emanating from his chambers, spectral sounds that hinted at unimaginable suffering within. Other, equally disturbing reports describe a deliberate campaign of psychological torment, total, crushing isolation designed to break his spirit, meager, barely sufficient meals that slowly starved him, and the insidious delivery of false messages of betrayal from his few remaining allies, twisting his mind with despair and paranoia. The overarching objective was clear: to utterly shatter his spirit, to reduce him to a husk of his former self, making his eventual demise seem less a murder and more a natural, merciful release. On the night of September 21st, with a clandestine precision, the executioners, these shadowy agents of power, finally acted. The most brutal and widely popularized version of his death, meticulously detailed by later, often sensationalist chroniclers, describes the use of that infamous red-hot iron. It was, according to these accounts, a horrific act of internal execution, a method chosen specifically because it would leave no telltale external traces, no definitive proof of foul play on the king's body. However, as with all clandestine acts of such magnitude, absolute certainty eludes history. Other theories, equally plausible and equally chilling, exist. Some whisper of suffocation with pillows, a more intimate and perhaps more merciful, yet still brutal end. Others suggest a more subtle, insidious poisoning. The exact, unvarnished truth of how Edward II drew his last breath has been tragically lost to the mists of time, obscured by layers of deliberate obfuscation and partisan accounts. Yet regardless of the precise method, the profound horror of his final moments, the sheer brutality of his fate, remains an undeniable haunting stain on the annals of English history. The uncertainty surrounding his death only serves to amplify its grim legend. Then, a full 10 years after Edward II's official yet deeply suspect death, a mysterious and tantalizing letter materialized at the papal court in Avignon. It was known as the Fieschi Letter, penned by a Genoese priest named Manuel Fieschi, a man of some standing in the ecclesiastical world. In this extraordinary document, the priest made a stunning, almost unbelievable claim. He alleged that Edward II had, in fact, managed to escape from Berkeley Castle, aided by a clandestine network of loyal sympathizers. Furthermore, Fieschi asserted that the deposed king had subsequently lived a reclusive life as a hermit in Italy under an assumed identity, far from the machinations of English politics. The priest dramatically claimed that he had personally confessed the former king, who was living a life of profound penance for his past sins and errors. The authenticity of the Fieschi Letter as a document, that is, its physical existence and its authorship by Manuel Fieschi, is largely confirmed by historians. However, its actual content, the truth of its extraordinary claims, remains an enduring, tantalizing mystery, a riddle wrapped in historical intrigue. Some historians, peering through the centuries, suggest that Isabella and Mortimer, in a calculated move to consolidate their power and avoid the political martyrdom of a publicly executed king, might have deliberately faked Edward's death, allowing him to escape into obscurity while they secured the throne for his son. Others, equally convinced, believe that the letter itself was a clever forgery, a carefully crafted piece of propaganda designed to destabilize the newly established authority of Edward III, who, years later, would dramatically execute Mortimer for treason, finally breaking his mother's hold on power. Edward II's tomb, a solemn monument located within the grand Gothic splendor of Gloucester Cathedral, eventually became a significant place of pilgrimage, drawing crowds of the faithful and the curious alike. But the fundamental question lingers. Was the king's body truly interred there, beneath that elaborate effigy, or was it merely another masterful, final staging by the architects of history, a carefully constructed illusion to cement a new order? Edward II's story is a tragedy composed of countless interwoven layers, a complex tapestry woven with threads of personal vulnerability, political intrigue, and ultimate destruction. He was, in essence, a sensitive king trapped within a brutal, unforgiving medieval world that demanded ruthless strength and martial prowess. He was a monarch who tragically found solace not in governing with the iron fist and consuming fire expected of his station, but in the gentle lightness of flowing waters and the intimate warmth of personal affections. This profound disconnect between his true nature and the rigid expectations of his role, however, exacted a catastrophic toll, costing him his throne, his cherished freedom, and quite possibly his very life. The association between his perceived effeminacy and his devastating downfall was eagerly exploited by later, often biased chroniclers who readily weaponized these aspects to justify his deposition and vilify his memory. Yet centuries later, as historical perspectives broadened and softened, he would be painstakingly reinterpreted by a new generation of historians, by insightful playwrights, and by evocative filmmakers. They transformed him from a caricature of weakness into a truly tragic, deeply vulnerable, and profoundly human figure, a monarch whose personal struggles resonated across the ages. His death, whether it was a brutal, agonizing execution or a cleverly orchestrated, elaborate staging, transcended the mere act itself. It became a powerful symbol of the eternal struggle between personal desire, the individual's longing for authenticity, and the crushing, often dehumanizing demands of the crown. His son, Edward III, a far more pragmatic and ruthless ruler than his father, would learn profoundly from the devastating errors of Edward II. This painful education would equip him to guide England towards a period of remarkable military glory and expansion, forever cementing his place in history as one of England's most formidable warrior kings. But the spectral shadow of his father, the memory of his tragic fall, never truly ceased to loom over his long and successful reign, a constant, unspoken reminder of the fragility of power and the dangers of misrule. Edward II's tomb in Gloucester Cathedral continued to be a place of immense pilgrimage, its significance growing exponentially, particularly after his son, Edward III, finally assumed effective control of the throne and, with ruthless political calculation, condemned Roger Mortimer for treason in 1330, thus dismantling the power behind his mother's regency. Mortimer, the audacious co-conspirator, was executed with grim finality, and Isabella, the once powerful queen who had orchestrated her husband's downfall, was unceremoniously deposed from her power and confined to a convent for the remainder of her life, living out her days in quiet, ignominious seclusion. Edward II's tumultuous reign passed into the annals of history as a poignant and enduring symbol of profound political and deeply personal decadence. His complex and often controversial relationships with figures like Gaveston and the Despensers remain, even to this day, a vibrant and fertile ground for intense historical debate. Some historians, with a modern lens, view him as a groundbreaking pioneer of emotional vulnerability within the rigid confines of medieval monarchy, a king ahead of his time in his openness to personal affection. Others, more traditional in their assessment, simply consider him fundamentally incompetent, a weak ruler ill-suited for the harsh demands of his era. Regardless of the interpretation, his dramatic downfall fundamentally reshaped English politics for decades to come, meticulously redefining the previously blurred and often unchallenged limits of royal power. He holds the unique yet tragic distinction of being the first English king to be formally and publicly deposed, an unprecedented and chilling precedent that would send shivers down the spines of countless future monarchs, forever reminding them of the precariousness of their position. The enigmatic figure of Edward II, whether he is ultimately cast as a wronged martyr or a flawed tyrant, continues, centuries later, to provoke endless interpretations, to fuel academic debate, and to captivate with an enduring, almost irresistible fascination. Invisible History is more than just a channel. It is your exclusive guide through the forgotten, often unsettling backstages of power, a journey into the hidden truths that mainstream history often overlooks. We delve deep into the raw, unfiltered narratives of betrayals that tore apart kingdoms, the chilling details of executions carried out in the shadows, the intricate web of conspiracies that reshape nations, and the profound, echoing silences that reverberate through time, bearing witness to unspeakable acts. Here, in every meticulously researched video, we tirelessly endeavor to reveal the long-guarded secrets that school textbooks, in their sanitized versions of the past, conveniently prefer to conceal. Have you ever truly imagined how many other kings, seemingly secure upon their thrones, were ultimately silenced by the very weight of their own crowns, their voices muffled by the demands of power? Have you ever dared to consider how many queens, outwardly gracious and commanding, orchestrated brutal assassinations from behind their diplomatic smiles, their true motives hidden by a veneer of regal charm? If your thirst for these profound, untold stories matches ours, if you yearn for more, narratives as captivating and disturbing as that of Edward II, then do not hesitate. Subscribe to the Invisible History channel immediately. Activate the notification bell so you never miss a revelation. And most importantly, share this video with anyone who clings to the romanticized notion that monarchy was merely about luxurious pomp and superficial grandeur. Prepare yourself. Prepare to truly know the darkest, most unsettling side of history, a realm where the unvarnished truth, once exposed, burns far, far hotter than any red-hot iron.